Okay, so moving right along here to part two, where we're going to look at Lord Byron, who's one of those six most well-known romantic poets. But we're also going to take a look at the Gothics and the textbook's introduction to the Gothics, because we're finishing out our study of Romanticism now with Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley. And these are the three poets, writers who were really influenced by the emergence of Gothic literature. Keats was also part of that generation, but like I said, he set himself apart from that group, and his poetry, while it explores the dark side of Romanticism through his foreboding sense of death, doesn't emphasize the Gothic elements of that genre, doesn't utilize those the way Byron and the Shelleys do. So here we go. The Gothic and the development of a mass readership. The textbook already talked about in the introduction to Romanticism how more people were learning to read, the middle class, and even the lower and working class to a certain extent. And that'll really become true in the mid 19th century and really impact the Victorian period, the period we're going to study next. But it did indeed impact the Romantic period. And so you had these very highbrow writers like Wordsworth, but at the same time, and those writers appealed to the upper class, but at the same time, you had the middle class and even parts of the working class and lower class starting to learn to read. And what was appealing to them? Novels more so than poetry, and specifically the Gothic genre of novels. So the development of a massive readership led to a rise in the Gothic as a genre. What is the Gothic genre? Well, really, it's a style of architecture used to describe old castles and other similar buildings. And these older, kind of dark and gloomy um, pieces of architecture serve as the perfect setting for terrifying stories. They evoked the macabre, the mysterious, the supernatural, and the pleasurably terrifying. So central to the idea of the Gothic is the idea that it's fun or pleasurable to be scared, which is an idea that, I think it's true of our human nature. We do enjoy that, but it carries on today. You can see the popularity of horror movies and thrillers and other things like that. Um, there's also a connection to the past. So um, these old gloomy castles were also associated with the past. They were relics from the medieval period. And so the medieval period, again, was famous for these romances, right? And so that's kind of where the title Romanticism came from for this movement, was through that revival of medieval romance themes. And so you'll often hear the term Gothic romance, because there's also a sense of romance usually caught up in Gothic storylines. And and so you have these old kind of terrifying castles or similar structures as the setting. You have some kind of romantic element. You have the sense of the past, of the undead, perhaps even, and all of that coalesces together to form what we now know is the Gothic genre. And it's always been wrapped up in the architecture. Even before people started to write Gothic novels and stories in the 18th century, the architecture started to come back in garden design. How did it come about in literature? Well, Horace Walpole was the first author to really write a truly Gothic novel in the late 18th century. In his novel, The Castle of Otranto, is considered by many the first Gothic novel. But he also bought this home called Strawberry Hill and lived in this old Gothic castle. And it was really popular. It's funny, people wanted to come to Strawberry Hill and see Horace Walpole's home in this old Gothic castle. So he's really the figure. We're not reading him, and I'll explain why, but he's really the figure both in literature and architecture associated with it, causing the spark that ignited the Gothic revival. Um, so I already talked about this a little bit, but the Gothic was seen in many ways as a reclamation of the primitive emotions of fear and wonder provided by the romances of the pre-Enlightenment age. So I've talked about before how Romanticism is coming right on the heels of the Enlightenment And literary movements are so often a reaction to the previous literary movement. And the Enlightenment was so focused on the logic and the rational mind, and was very much as the Enlightenment was about as unemotional and unspontaneous and unimaginative of a, and it was really more of a philosophical movement than a literary movement, but it was about as unemotional, unspontaneous, unimaginative of a philosophical or literary movement as you could get. And so Romanticism embraced, as you've seen so far, emotion, spontaneity, imagination, and all types of emotions, all ranges of emotions. But with the darker side of Romanticism, they embraced fear and wonder and being terrified and enjoying being terrified. And a lot of the medieval romances had some Gothic elements that provided that. So they revived those and then imbued them with also traits of Romanticism. Um, and this, although it did really take off late in the latter part of Romanticism, it was part of the early part too. Um, the big writers are the ones who didn't have Gothic elements till later on. But as early as the 1790s, novels of horror and mystery and faraway settings flooded the book market. And Horace Walpole had the template for that, and then other novels followed. So there's another element here where often you see the faraway setting, a strange eastern land. So there's kind of a colonialism and imperialism thing going on, but it has much to do with the idea that these faraway lands were strange and mysterious, the same way the castles of England's past were. One thing I really want to point out is the centrality of the female author to the Gothic genre. Anne Radcliffe, who we're going to look at in just a minute, was the most popular writer of the day and in the Gothic genre, and she was quite successful. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, which is the most famous, most lasting novel of the genre, and Jane Austen didn't really dabble in the Gothic too much. But of her 6 novels, we talked about 5 of them in the previous lecture. Northanger Abbey, The Outlier, is a satire of the Gothic genre, and she was the most popular female writer of the day. So even though she wasn't a true and true Gothic, she still dabbled, even if it was just to mock the genre. She still dabbled. So you have the most popular Gothic writer being a female, um, the author of the most popular Gothic novel being a female, and the most popular female author of the day really, um, still dabbling in it, still engaging with it is a better way to put that. And then I think if you were to do some kind of, this is just conjecture, but if you were to do some kind of statistical survey, you would look and see, how many of the Gothic novelists were female. I think my guess would be more of them would be female than male. There's really something about these settings that create a feeling of being trapped or imprisoned. That's part of the terrifying. And the female authors of the Gothic genre are able to use that in a subversive way to critique the constraints of that the patriarchal society placed on females. And so another way to put that would be the Gothic genre created opportunities for female authors to engage with the ideas they wanted to engage with that perhaps the mainstream poetry did not allow or did not enable to the same extent. And then my last point here is the big time romantic poets had a love-hate relationship with the Gothic genre. I think they loved to read it and they incorporated elements of it into their writing, but they often critiqued and criticized it, called it lowbrow because it appealed to these mass readers. So it's another kind of hypocritical element in their work. Since they did glorify the ordinary, they also often consider the ordinary kind of lowbrow. And certainly the Gothic is not ordinary, but I'm talking about the readers would have been classified as ordinary. So it's an interesting, complex relationship worth studying more if you're interested in it. As I mentioned, Radcliffe was the most popular Gothic writer of the day in terms of writers who didn't really do things other than Gothic, didn't go beyond that genre. Her most famous work is The Mysteries of Udolpho, and we have a short excerpt from it here we're going to look at. And we're looking at her because she was the most popular Gothic writer, and female, although if you're really interested in this genre, you could look more. And other pieces of writing I'd recommend from it would be Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, because that's considered like the first Gothic work, and then Matthew Lewis's The Monk, because it is just filled with so much crazy Gothic stuff. But as a class in this lecture, we're going to look at the Mysteries of Udolpho, because it's really, other than Frankenstein, probably the most famous Gothic novel. And the I don't have a thread slide since we're also looking at Byron. I want to go through this as fast as I can, but the one central idea here I want to look at is what I just mentioned about the way the Gothic novel enabled female writers to use the settings of the Gothic novel in their terror, their confinement, their imprisonment in those settings to critique the patriarchal standards of the day. And so here's one quote from it. I should set the context here of this is the female main character, Emily St. Augustine, is with her guardian and they're going to his home, which is this isolated castle in the woods. And the guardian here is clearly a bad guy. Another theme of Gothic novels, especially by female writers, was that the fathers, the uncles, the guardians, the people who were supposed to be protectors of the women often abuse their power and abuse those women. And so her guardian here is clearly a bad guy. She's in a forced situation where she has to go live with him in this castle. And this is the description as they're approaching the castle. It really emphasizes everything I just said. The extent and darkness of these tall woods awakened terrific images in her mind. Terrific as in terrifying rather than how we think of terrific today. And she almost expected to see banditti start up from under the trees. At length the carriages emerged upon a heathy rock, and soon after reached the castle gates, where the deep tone of the portal bell, which was struck upon to give notice of their arrival, increased the fearful emotions that had assailed Emily. So as they approach his home, his castle, they basically she just gets, more and more terrified because she knows she's going to be constrained in there. She won't be able to leave this place. She knows this guy is probably not a good dude. And the patriarchal standards of the day, if we were to go into her family background, you'd get the context. But basically, she has to live there. And so, Radcliffe could just send her to any old castle, but instead she sends her to one that's isolated by the woods. There's really no way to get out of here or to get help. And the idea that it looks like bandits are going to come from the woods is that these castles were places of danger, that there'd be unsavory figures there. So it's really the worst place for her to be. The bandits imply that the castle is not only the description of it, of the woods, shows that it's inescapable. The presence of the bandits show that it's unsafe. To elaborate, Emily's fear is shared by the reader. This enables Radcliffe to evoke sympathy for the heroine, whilst also creating an exhilarating experience for the reader. The former helps make the Gothic genre worthy of studying, and the latter is one of the main reasons it was so popular at the time. So two things going on. One thing is happening. This is terrifying, but it allows two things to happen. One, it's really scary and suspenseful, which I'm sure you would agree with me. We all love reading suspenseful things that keep us on the edge of our seat or watching them. That's why the Gothic genre was so popular. But at the same time, it also allowed for this subversive element where because the specific things that make the setting and the story suspenseful show a woman basically how few options she has and how she's constrained, then it enables this critique of the lack of freedom for women of the day. So there's kind of two things going on with this presentation of this suspenseful, terrifying narrative. We'll take a look at one more quote here to finish out our analysis of this Gothic novel that carries on these ideas even more. As the carriage wheels rolled heavily under the portcullis, Emily's heart sunk and she seemed as if she was going into her prison. The gloomy court into which she passed served to confirm the idea, and her imagination, ever awake to circumstance, suggested even more terrors than her reason could justify. The phrase "more terrors than her reason could justify" really gets at two key things that were part of the Gothic. The supernatural. There could be things going on here that are beyond what her mind can grasp. But also the failure or limits of the rational reasoning mind. So again, the Romanticism was in part a reaction against the logic and rationalism of the Enlightenment, and we've seen how that's manifested in terms of the emotion and spontaneity and imagination in the poetry. But in the Gothic genre, it often was expressed by writers through the loss of sanity, the loss of the ability to reason. You often had people going crazy, going insane in Gothic novels, and that was another way for them to show that the human mind is not a purely rational thing, and rational, logical reasoning can only go so far. And so here, Emily is confronted with something so terrifying that she can't reason her way around it. The castle represents a prison for Emily, and again, the female authors of the Gothic genre used its setting as metaphors for the confining strictures of the patriarchal society of the time. So that's kind of my summing up idea for the little unit here on the Gothic novel. We can really see that in the setting from the Mysteries of Udolpho. And I think Emily's inability here the failure of her reasoning shows that she might very well go insane. And if you look into this further, you can see how asylums were used as a way to imprison women at the time, and really the patriarchal society was so constraining and so oppressive, it actually drove women insane. And so this is a circumstance in which Emily could go insane if she's not rescued. And so that's another theme that Radcliffe is trying to convey that was central to the Gothics, I would argue, feminist project, and rightfully so. And not going to tell you what happens. The Mysteries of Udolpho is a long novel, but it's worth your time if you ever have a summer where you have time to read the Gothics. All right, so now we're going to take a look at Byron, who was clearly influenced by the Gothics, and is one of our 6 major poets. A little bit of background on him. He had a love-hate relationship with his mother. Love at a distance, but hate up close. When they were around each other, they did not get along, but they sent beautiful letters to each other. Byron is an interesting figure. He was immensely popular during his lifetime. In Europe, more so than England, but still just really popular. He was like a rock star, is how I've heard him described in his day. And he was in many ways the first real celebrity, in terms of a celebrity is someone who is so famous they have a complicated relationship with their public that goes beyond just the works or the art they produce. Charles Dickens, who we'll study in 2 lessons, is in many ways the first true celebrity because he actually engaged with and responded to his public, whereas Byron, he did engage with his public to a certain extent, but not to the great degree Dickens did. He was more just adored by his public. But so he's like a rock star, perhaps the first true celebrity in a true sense of the term of what celebrity means. And along these lines, we have the term Byronism, which is his persona. We don't really know that much about Byron the man, what he was truly like, in private, not in public. But he has this complex, fascinating persona that was how the world perceived him. It is what we know about him. And in terms of understanding how his works are influential to Romanticism and literary history in general, the Byron persona more than Byron the person is probably more important. But it's an important distinction. We don't really know what he was like, but we know the persona he had with the public, and that's what's important to study. Going along with this persona, we should talk about his appearance a little because that was part of the persona. But he was extremely handsome. Coleridge as an example of how handsome Byron was, Coleridge, who to my knowledge was entirely heterosexual, said that about Byron's eyes. His eyes open the portals of the sun. So that's just like an extreme example to give you an idea of how attractive Byron was. And that was just all kind of wrapped up in this persona that, made him like a rock star at the time. In his appearance, he was always well dressed. And one of his friends wrote a novella, a short Gothic novel called The Vampire, spelled Vampyre. That was one of the very first works about vampires. And so to this day, I mean, now with things like True Blood and things, you have different examples of what vampires can look like. But until the last 5 or 10 years, there was really this cliche of the vampire being well dressed in a dark suit with a cape. That's how Byron dressed. And his friend who wrote this short novel about vampires based the main character on Byron and had him dressed that way. So the like well dressed vampire, the Bela Lugosi Dracula cliche, that's actually based on Lord Byron, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Um, his writing was incredibly popular during his lifetime. He wrote these stories that really appealed to people during the Romantic Age. Some of his most popular works were ones set in faraway places. To build on what we just talked about with the Romantics, these faraway, mysterious settings, Byron really captured that. It's one of the reasons why he was famous. And so, two examples are the Giaour, which means the word Giaour means infidel in Muslim society. So that was one of his Eastern tales, and I didn't assign it, but there's actually an excerpt from it in the book if you want to take a look at it. And he had another one called The Corsair, which means pirate. So these are just a few examples of his kind of mainstream works that were popular at the time he was alive. Um, Going along with this persona and personality he had, he was really despicable in his treatment of women. It's unfortunate. He had numerous liaisons with women, including his half sister, which really gave him quite a reputation to the point where he had to leave England. So he had this mass reading public who adored him, but at the same time, the highly moral English, kind of disapproved of a lot of his behavior. And that's why he was even more popular than Europe, which was more accepting of his behavior, especially Greece, than England. And he had to leave, I think, in 1816 or 1818, something like that. He had to leave England, mainly because this relationship with his half sister became known publicly. But like I said, he was really despicable in his treatment of women. It's really inexcusable. He had a relationship with Mary Shelley's stepsister, and he had Claire Claremont. After Mary Wollstonecraft died, William Godwin married a woman named Claremont, and so one of his children with her, I guess they'd be half sisters then, or maybe she had children from another marriage. Anyway, was Claire Claremont one of the children from Godwin's next wife after Mary Wollstonecraft died? So Mary Shelley's half sister or stepsister. She was friends with the Shelleys and traveled with them and got to know Byron that way. And yeah, once he impregnated her, he abandoned her, and she was one of several women he impregnated and abandoned. So he really was despicable in that sense. Finally, the last point I'll share about him is he was celebrated as a national hero in Greece. Greece at this time was battling the Ottoman Empire, and Byron actually, when he left England, he went to Greece because he was well loved there. He visited there earlier. His literature was very popular in Greece, and he felt for the plight of the Greece people in battling the Ottoman Empire and wanted to help them. So he served in their military. He even trained up troops, which I don't necessarily expect from everything else I know about his personality, but fought with them. But he, while training the troops and whatnot, his health eventually gave out, and he died at the age of 36, which is much older than Keats and Shelley, but younger than Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge in terms of how old he was when he died. So that just hopefully gives you a good picture of who Byron was and helping to understand his writing. So why is he important? Well, he came up with this type of protagonist that was characteristic in his literature that we now call the Byronic hero. And um, the Byronic hero is such a significant type of protagonist. He's often come to be seen as a defining feature of Romanticism. So, in other words, sometimes people even call the Byronic hero the romantic hero. Um, because the Byronic hero, well, one thing that's different of the six major writers, six major poets from the Romantic period, Byron wrote narrative poetry. In other words, longer narrative poems that told a story rather than short lyric poetry. Some of the other writers did too, but for the other five writers, their short lyric poetry is really what's famous. Whereas for Byron, his long narrative poems are really what's famous. And so you have more of a protagonist, a character, at the center of Byron's works compared to the other five major poets. And in that sense, of those six poets, you have the only one who really creates like a protagonist that encapsulates all the themes and traits and values of Romanticism we've discussed so far. And so that's why, Wordsworth would probably shirk at the idea, but that's why sometimes people call the Byronic hero the romantic hero. And in many ways, it does, the Byronic hero does encapsulate romantic values, but at the same time, it's still very much a creation of Byron. So what is the Byronic hero like? He's alien as in different, set apart from the rest of society is what the term alien means in the textbook. Mysterious, there's an appeal about him, kind of like the appeal of an old castle or a faraway land. Gloomy, he's very kind of angsty and just not happy. Superior in passions and powers, so that he's a very passionate, lowercase romantic kind of figure, and usually has some kind of ability or supernatural ability that also sets him apart from the rest of society. He disdains the average person and is oblivious to ordinary concerns. So he's superior to the rest of society and really doesn't care about the average person. And that part of it is close to Byron. There's many of the traits here that are close to Byron himself. That's the one that's probably closest to Byron himself, aside from the passions one. Um, and so he did not, to suffice to say, Byron was not on board with the glorification of the ordinary idea from Wordsworth. Um, all right, continuing on here. A strong, compelling attraction to others. So there was something just very appealing or attractive about this character that drew others in. Again, like Byron, racked by enormous nameless guilt. Um, so this part's interesting. The Byronic hero was almost always driven by guilt. That was his motivating factor for his actions. But that guilt was often not directly identified. Um, and usually inevitably doomed. You can sense from early on, this guy's not going to make it by the end of the story, which again is like Byron, um, kind of doomed to die young. Again, not as young as Keats and Shelley, but toward the end of his life at age 36, went to fight in the Greek War. That guy is taking on these romantic idealized passions and pursuits and not probably going to live through them. So many of these traits Byron himself possessed. The nameless guilt one is interesting to me. I don't know if Byron was driven by guilt, but he certainly did things for which he should be guilty. And if he were driven by the guilt of them, I think that'd make him more sympathetic. Right now, he's not very sympathetic. But that was something he put into his protagonist. Maybe he wanted to feel guilt for the things he did and he didn't. I'm not sure. There are a couple numerous characters in literature after the Romantic period have displayed these traits. Ahab and Moby Dick is one of the best examples. He doesn't have some of the elements like the erotic elements, but he's got this monomaniacal passion where he is driven by one thing to destroy the well. And so that is kind of a Byronic type of a thing. Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte is also a great example. And I would argue, critics don't mention this as much, but I would argue that Lord Rochester in Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte is also an example. Another way the textbook describes the Byronic hero that I think is a good descriptor is like an arch rebel, but non-political with a strong erotic interest. So this rebel to society, but not so much fighting for a cause. And then obviously the romance, the sexual part was always part of it, lowercase romance. All right, so now we're going to take a look at Manfred, who I chose Manfred for a number of reasons. It's a play, and we haven't had a lot of opportunities to read plays in this class. Also, the textbook argues that it's the greatest manifestation of the Byronic hero. Some of the other narrative poems, like Don Juan and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, are kind of more classic examples, but this is the textbook argues, and I agree, the fullest, most developed version of the Byronic hero. It's a closet drama, which means it's a play, but Byron didn't intend for it to be performed. That's all the term closet genre means. And Byron himself called it a metaphysical drama, a drama of ideas. He began writing it in 1816 when he and the Shelleys were in the Swiss Alps, and they had a competition of who could write the best ghost story. And Mary Shelley obviously won this competition because she did Frankenstein. That came out of it. But this was Byron's contribution that emerged from that competition. The setting of the Alps is really important. I should probably have talked about the Alps more, but the Alps are very important to the Romantics. The Alps represent this pinnacle of nature, especially the darker side of nature, because they're so massive and so beautifully dramatic, but also represent the sheer force of nature that's almost overwhelming, the force of nature that can be dangerous to humankind. And so this Byron sets his story, his play Manfred, in the Alps, where he wrote it in that setting, really serves to give the terrifying, suspenseful, gothic mood of the story. Some of the inspirations for the character, Horace Walpole in that novel I mentioned, The Castle of Otranto, actually had a character called Manfred. Prometheus from Greek mythology, who we'll talk about more in the next lesson, would be another example. Milton's Satan from Paradise Lost, and then Faust from Goethe's play Faust. So Faust by Goethe is another closet drama from a little bit earlier in the 19th century, and it really similar, but it's kind of a retelling of a classic story, what we call the Faustian myth or Faustian story, where the protagonist basically makes a deal with the devil to have power. And it goes back to the story of Job from the Bible, where God allows the devil to tempt Job to see if he will reject God. And in the Bible, Job loses everything, but still wavers in his faith a bit, but by the end of the book still stays strong in his faith to God, and is often held up as Christians as this great example of faith through suffering. And so what the Faustian myths or Faustian stories, and this goes back to Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus in the Renaissance, and then is carried through in the 19th century by Goethe and Faust, and then Byron and Manfred is a story where rather than being tempted by suffering, the protagonist is tempted by the offer of power. And it's usually a magical power, basically the ability to control everything, and makes a pact with the devil, does not resist like Job did. And then the exploration of basically the deterioration of that individual's soul after they make the pact with the devil for power. Byron claimed he'd never heard of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and we know he couldn't read German, which is the language in which Goethe wrote. But Matthew Lewis, who I mentioned was the author of that crazy Gothic novel, The Monk, read parts of Goethe's Faust aloud to Byron in English. And parts of Manfred, if you look closely, are clearly based on Goethe's Faust. So much so that Goethe even publicly praised those specific parts of Manfred that seem to be based on his Faust. One of the key themes of Manfred is guilt. And this is the way that sets it apart from the Faustian myth a little bit. But Manfred is haunted by remorse, guilt, that nameless guilt of the Byronic hero. There are parts of it that allude to the idea, well, it's guilt over the death of his sister, whose name is Start, whose name is very similar to Byron's sister. And we don't know what happened. We don't know why she died. We don't know why he feels guilty, but there are subtle allusions that it could be an incestuous relationship and it could have somehow led to her death or suicide. If it was suicide, it's very vague. But if we read into those allusions, we can see how it parallels Byron's own life and his relationship with his half sister, which comes back to my question of, did Byron himself feel guilt for his actions? His literature seems to indicate he did or he wanted to. Finally, there's one other key important difference from Faust, and that's that Manfred, unlike Faust, rejects the offer to make a pact with the powers of darkness. And this is a totally romantic idea. He sets himself up as the totally autonomous man. In other words, he wants to be able to achieve his goal or his vision without the help of the devil. Or it's not the devil here like it is in Faust, but these demons, these spirits that visit him. And so those are two important differences from the Faust myth, but the Faust myth is important background. And so we'll explore those here as we look at the play. So here's a long quote from the play. This is right after, so it opens with Manfred is alone in the Alps and he feels this guilt and he wants the guilt to go away. So he summons 7 spirits to try to help him make the guilt go away. And so he initially wants that help from the supernatural powers. But through the first scene, they're not able to help him. And so this is the start of scene 2. And he's now looking out on the Alps, and the spirits have not been able to help him. And this is what he says. The spirits I have raised abandon me. The spells which I have studied baffle me. The remedy I have racked of tortured me. I lean no more on superhuman aid. It hath no power upon the past. And for the future, till the past be gulfed in darkness, it is not of my search, my mother earth. Manfred abandons the powers beyond his own when they cannot alleviate his guilt. The shadow of the past hangs over the entire play and seems inescapable. So again, that idea of guilt seems to be the predominant thought or theme. In the Faust legend, Faust wants more power, and that's why he makes a path here. But here, Manfred's goal is to be alleviated of this guilt he feels, and he summons the spirits to help him with that, but it doesn't work. And so this is a turning point in the play. It's why I chose to look at it, because it's here where he says he's no longer going to try to use the powers of the spirits, and he's solely going to rely on his own abilities. So it's a lead into the idea that Manfred, as the Byronic hero, is totally autonomous and does not need anyone else's power. And that's, like I said, a very romantic idea, that the Romantics wanted complete autonomy, to be free of the constraints of society, to not need society or civilization, to be completely immersed in nature, completely autonomous. And so you have that to a certain extent with Manfred. But the reason I say to a certain extent is his guilt, his remorse complicates this idea. He's in a certain way not completely autonomous. He's only rejecting the spirits here because they were unable to help him, which is another key difference from Faust. We're going to look at one more passage here, and this is right at the end of the play, where Manfred says, "Must crimes be punished by other crimes, and greater criminals? Back to thy hell, spirits! Thou hast no power over me, that I feel. Thou shalt never possess me, that I know. What I have done is done, I bear within. A torture which could nothing gain from thine. The mind which is immortal makes itself requital for its good or evil thoughts, its own origin of ill and end." So Manfred can feel no power over him here. So this reinforces the idea of the Romantics and the emphasis on feeling. He rejects the aid of the supernatural forces, the demons. So he appears to be the completely autonomous man. But as I said, in reality, guilt still holds a power over him. He can't seem to get out of that. And so, on the one hand, you have the ideal Byronic or romantic hero. He's completely autonomous. He believes he has no need or has rejected these spirits, these supernatural forces that could help him. And he's completely apart, completely independent and autonomous from society. But he hasn't escaped this guilt, and the guilt is holding him back. He talks there about being immortal, but then he dies on the next page. So on the one hand, this portrays kind of the ultimate romantic vision for the protagonist. But on the other hand, does it undermine it? That's my question. Is the completely autonomous man, well, two questions. I should have put two questions here. One, is he truly autonomous if he is racked by guilt? And then the other question, could he even be completely autonomous? Or is this completely autonomous man even Byron's vision? That seems what the Romantics want, but is what they really want. So as we're getting to the end of the unit on the Romantics, the idea I'm throwing out there is oftentimes a literary movement will question its own values and goals because it's a complicated, often paradoxical relationship. So is Byron creating the ultimate romantic hero there and then tearing that down at the same time? Because all of Byron's works deal with this theme of guilt. It was so important to him. And the last question I ask, and this answers the other question, so is it anti-romantic? Is seeming to die on his own terms, and seeming to die on his own terms, does Manfred achieve complete autonomy? So in other words, it seems like he dies when he wants to, how he wants to, without the help of the spirits. And so when we say immortal, do we mean immortal in the sense of living forever? Or do we mean immortal in the sense of what the Romantics have done will last forever? And arguably it will, or at least a really long time, because 200 years later we're studying them. And so is he maybe actually autonomous? You know, how he dies, I think, has to figure into this question. And so is it anti-romantic? Is it romantic through the way he dies? What does it mean to be romantic? I mean, I think Byron's play here, Manfred, gets at the essence of romanticism through the questions it poses. Because the Romantics, they rejected Christianity. And here Byron is rejecting the supernatural. And many of them died young. So maybe it's immortality through different means or different grounds. Maybe that was the goal. These are speculations on my part. I'd love to see how you answer them in your opinion in the threads and thesis.